On this episode of Barracuda Restoration, how to restore a 7.25 Mopar differential. I'm Angel Garrido, and I'm restoring my dad's 1969 Plymouth Barracuda Fastback. Follow along as I show you how I restore this classic A-body muscle car to OEM standards. I include suspension, steering, differential, engine, interior, brakes, trim, and more. It's all here on Barracuda Restoration. After 50 years, my differential needed rebuilding, as you can see from this photo. I will be covering the restoration of that 7 1/4 rear axle differential. Now, Mopar made 5 different differentials. Depending on the model, there will be differences. Consult your Plymouth factory service manual for specifics. The 1967 to 69 years are consistent. I won't be covering the differential gears and pinion. I don't have the proper tools and the subject is beyond my scope of knowledge. And we won't cover the rear drum brake assembly. We'll do that in another episode. So let's get started. My 1969 A-body Barracuda came with a 9-bolt pattern 7 1/4 rear axle. This was standard on the 318 equipped cars. The 65 to 72 A-bodies were available with the 8 3/4 axle. After removing the leaf springs and wheels, power steam your differential. These things are pretty dirty and you don't want that crud all over your shop. Use a degreaser like Simple Green, Goo Gone, or the like. You will now be able to identify your rear end. In the bottom right corner is the cast number. Mine is 200700051. Made in 1967. In the top left corner is the casting date, 8/12, which is the week of June 24 through 30. So that means my rear end is not original to the car. It actually came from a 1967 Dart. The axle shaft assembly, oil seals, and drive pinion oil seals can be removed and serviced without removing the complete assembly from the vehicle. Caution: it is absolutely necessary that anytime an axle assembly is serviced and the axle shafts are loosened and removed, the axle shaft gaskets and inner axle shaft oil seals must be replaced. Remove the drain plug in the cover assembly and drain lubricant from the housing. Since I'm going to be chrome plating my differential cover, I will remove it and drain the lubricant from the housing by simply tilting the differential. Inspect the differential bearing cone, cups, and rollers for pitting, spalling, or other visible damage. You should be able to read the axle gear ratio number on the drive gear. Mine is 2.93. I've already removed the brake drum from the axle shaft studs. Using an access hole in the axle shaft flange, remove the retainer nuts. Now remove the axle shaft from the differential. If the axle won't come out, attach an axle shaft removing tool or slide hammer to the axle shaft flange and remove the axle shaft. This picture shows how the axle bearing rusted to the axle housing. It was probably due to moisture. Remove the brake assembly. Disconnect the brake lines from the rear end. Disconnect the parking brake cable from the brake backing plate. This cable is attached to the plate by 3 clips. One technique to remove the cable is to use a hose clamp to squeeze the clips together so as to clear the lip of the cable hole. Remove the brake wheel cylinders. Disconnect the hydraulic flexible line and remove the proportioning valve from the axle housing. Disconnect the brake lines from the rear end. With a wire wheel attached to a portable grinder, remove the years of grit and paint from the differential housing. When done, do a quick wiping with a degreaser. If sandblasting, care must be taken with the inside of the housing. A good paint shop will hang the differential for easy painting. I don't have that ability, so I just painted it outside for ventilation. I rested the rear end on 2 jacks. I would paint one side, let it dry, then rotate it and paint the other end. Now you want to primer the rear end. I used epoxy primer as a base coat. This is what I used. Lastly, give the rear end several coats of high gloss black automotive paint. Let the whole thing dry for a day or two. Remove the axle shaft oil seal from the housing. Clean up the axle housing edges. Install the new axle shaft oil seals in the axle housing. I use National Oil Seals. Use a seal driver kit to evenly drive the oil seals into the axle housing. I bought mine from Harbor Freight Tools. Use the right size disc to push the seal. Drive the seal in using light taps with a hammer or mallet until it stops at the shaft lip. Note the red material along the rim. This shows you the seal has been properly fitted. The 7 1/4 has 4 bolts to hold the axle assembly to the axle housing. 8 3/4 use 5 bolts. The 8 3/4 uses a steel flange between the axle housing and the brake backing plate. My 7 1/4 does not, and the factory service manual doesn't call for one. But I felt a Fel-Pro gasket kit should be used to make a gasket between the housing and backing plate to prevent water and dust to enter the axle housing. There is a foam gasket that goes between the backing plate and the axle flange. I took that foam gasket and used it as a template. That gasket comes from Fel-Pro. It's the Fel-Pro rear axle flange gasket. I used the Fel-Pro sheet material. Trace the foam gasket onto the Fel-Pro blue gasket. Cut it out with an X-Acto knife or scissors. It's that easy. Put a very thin coat of blue silicone on both sides of the blue gasket and attach it to the axle flange. Unless you have the proper tools, send out your axle to have the bearing collars and seals replaced. If you are going to do a replacement of the bearings yourself, under no circumstances should axle shaft collars or bearings be removed using a torch. The use of a torch is an unsafe practice because heat is fed into the axle shaft bearing journal, thereby weakening this area. Note, on the 7 1/4, the axle links are the same. The pinion gear assembly is in the center of the differential. On the 8 3/4, the axles are different links because the pinion gear assembly is off-center. The backing plate needs to go on now. As you can see, I had mine powder coated. Remember, the parking brake cable hole should be facing the front of the car. Install the foam gasket on the studs of the axle housing and position the brake support plate assembly on the axle housing. Carefully slide the axle shaft assembly through the axle seal and engage the splines in the differential side gear. Position the retainer plate over the axle housing studs. Tap the end of the axle shaft lightly with a non-metallic mallet to position the axle shaft bearing into the housing bearing bore. Install the retainer nuts and tighten to 35 foot-pounds. Check the axle rotation for binding, noise, or interference. By turning the left axle forward, the right axle should spin in the opposite direction. Again, on a sure grip, the axles will spin in the same direction. Attach the parking brake cables to the backing plates. The long cable should be on the passenger side and the shorter one on the driver's side. The pin should click right into the backing plate hole. Test the fit. Clean and polish the brass proportioning valve. Use a wire wheel to do so. Attach the valve to the axle shaft on the upper driver's side. It should have a kind of angled rounded surface to rest on the shaft edge. Attach the hydraulic cable. Attach the carrier bumper. Before attaching the differential cover, scrub the face with a 3M pad and wipe clean. Add a Felpro differential gasket. Use a thin coat of blue silicone sealer on both sides of the gasket and attach it to the face. Attach the cover plate and tighten the bolts to 20 foot-pounds. Be sure to add the brake line clamp. I purchased my cable and all brake lines and fuel lines from Inline Products. If you send them your old ones, they will copy it to the T. Multi-purpose gear lubricant is required for all Sure Grip differentials. This is a 75-90 gear oil for the rear end. Capacity for the 7 1/4 is 2 pints. The 8 3/4 is 4 pints. A fluid level check is recommended. When this check is performed with the car in a level position, the fluid level should be 1/4 of an inch below the filler plug opening. Well, that's it. It was fairly easy, and I hope you learned something. Watch my other DIY videos, and for more information, be sure to visit my website, www.barracudarestoration.com. Thanks for watching Barracuda Restoration.
Plymouth is out to win you over this year. Follow your heart to your Plymouth dealer today.